Gun violence was another issue Governor Lujan Grisham mentioned in her State of the State address. And we know several gun laws have already been pre-filed this session. One of those involves so-called extreme risk protection orders, or red flag laws. These work like a restraining order, but allow a judge to order the temporary removal of guns from someone deemed a threat to themselves or others. Now, at least 13 other states have such laws, and many more are considering them. Correspondent Megan Kamerick joins us this week to explore more about the idea with the sponsor of the bill, Representative Damon Ely. That will be followed by a discussion about the merits of the idea with supporters and opponents of the extreme risk orders.
Representative Damon Ely, thank you for joining us on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Why do we need a law in New Mexico creating extreme risk protection orders?
You know, I actually can answer that question with a story.
Okay.
So as we were preparing for this bill, I go and talk at community events. So I went to go talk to the New Mexico Psychiatrists Association. And I try to get there early to get an idea as to what's happening and who's talking. And ahead of me was the behavioral health unit from APD. And one of the detectives was up there talking, and he was describing this very bill and how they needed it. Mm-hmm. And so the answer is, this is a tool for law enforcement and for family members that we need.
So how would this work? Would law enforcement petition a judge?
Law enforcement or a household member.
Okay.
So what would happen is you would file, and we have this in the law already, of a temporary restraining order, so we have kind of the process out. But this is different because what we're asking a court to do is to issue an order to temporarily remove guns from the household for people who are in imminent danger to themselves or others. So we're talking about then a hearing within 10 days so that the person that's affected has the ability to call witnesses, bring in evidence, cross-examine, and then that order can't be issued for more than a year, it can be less than, and after a year it's extinguished unless it's extended again with a hearing. So there's all these protections set up, but it gives law enforcement another, to use an old expression, arrow in their quiver, to make sure that family members and law enforcement, if they see somebody that's dangerous to themselves or others, and it's themselves is the thing I want to focus on a little bit, there's a tool to do it. There's not a tool now.
So what's the threshold here if someone is deemed a threat to themselves or others?
So it's imminent threat, so it has to be something immediate. Mm-hmm. It has to be something that a judge decides. So there's a hearing, so there's some kind of due process involved. And what we're really worried about is, you know, the public sees mass shootings, which are obviously important, and which could have been impacted, for example, at Parkland's a good example of this.
Because there was indications the shooters in some of these cases clearly had issues.
Usually a family member that'll call law enforcement and say, I'm really scared, I don't know what to do. Law enforcement comes out, they'll talk to the person, but they have no ability to do anything beyond that. Mm-hmm. Nobody's talking about committing a crime. You're literally talking about taking the dangerous instrumentality, in this case a gun, out of the house. And I want to make sure that your listeners are aware, this is a bipartisan effort. 11 states have already passed this. 5 states have had Republican governors that have signed off on this. So the whole idea is, and we've tried to work with both sides of the aisle. Mm-hmm. So I'm very confident this bill is going to get through.
So the idea is a family member would call the police, say, I'm very afraid, the police might come out, do a welfare check or something like that, and then go to a judge and say, this person is a threat. They could be getting ready to kill themselves, they could be getting ready to harm others. We want you to issue this order.
Or the family members could do it themselves.
Okay.
They don't have to go through the police.
Okay.
They could actually go down to the courthouse themselves. They could do the same petition.
So then the judge grants this petition. Correct. And then immediately?
Within 10 days, there has to be a hearing. So that's pretty immediate.
So before they take the guns away?
No, the guns come out.
Okay.
The guns come out right away because that's the immediate threat, right? Okay. So let's talk about why that's so important. Suicides, all right? Let's focus on that. So New Mexico has, I think it's the 4th highest suicide rate in the country. We're twice the national average. Half of all suicides are committed by guns. This really impacts veterans and young people. Those numbers are off the charts. If we can get guns removed, That, I'm not saying it solves the problem, but it sure helps. And I had forgotten my reading glasses, but there's actually a quote from our former governor now, Susana Martinez's Department of Health, where they said in 2018, temporarily removing a firearm from the homes of persons with increased suicidal risk has been shown to reduce suicides. So we know this works. The idea is get in there quickly, get the guns out. We're not trying to take away anybody's guns away forever. We're just trying to remove a potential really life-threatening danger.
So that happens, and then a hearing is held.
Correct.
And the person whose guns and ammunition were taken away
Correct.
can then go to this hearing, have an attorney, call witnesses.
They absolutely
Okay.
can.
And so if the judge rules, no, we still need to keep your guns, how long does that period last
So
where they
the-
cannot have guns?
The order can be up to a year. After that, it's extinguished, so
Okay.
it goes away. I'm a lawyer, so I talk like a lawyer. So it goes away.
Okay.
So there has to be another hearing, and hopefully the imminent threat is gone. And so the idea is to balance people's right to due process, people's right to own guns, versus the threat that they can pose to themselves or others.
We already have a pretty overburdened court system right now. Wouldn't this add to that? How could we do this expeditiously?
And we've spent a lot of time with the court system talking about that very issue. I agree with that. That's a whole nother issue, but this is one the courts are okay with. They understand what's going to happen. My hope is that in addition to this kind of bill, and we talked about it a little bit before the cameras went on, that the public's going to start to understand we really have overburdened not just our court system, but the entire criminal justice system. Law enforcement, public defenders, prosecutors, the courts, behavioral health systems. We're really going to try, and I'm going to push very hard for putting money, as well as other legislators, to try and put money into the system so that it's adequately funded.
In some other states where this has been set up, there's actually a dedicated section of the DA or the prosecutor's office just for these kinds of orders, and maybe a judge dedicated. Is that what we're picturing here?
Don't know yet.
Okay.
Don't know. That's going to be, I do think we have 13 judicial districts. Every judicial district around the state is going to do this differently. The one thing that I have seen as a legislator, my brief time there, is the state does a lousy job of micromanaging what happens at the local level. So maybe in Bernalillo County, the approach will be different than, say, it is in Colfax County. So I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all model on how to administer that, and that's not in the bill.
Okay. That has, sometimes we've seen in other states where this has passed, there's uneven implementation and enforcement. So I hear you saying you're going to let local municipalities, districts figure this out, but will there be a mechanism to make sure that they are using the tool?
That's also something we're talking
Okay.
about. So it is not just on this issue, but on all programs in the criminal justice system. We want to make sure they work. And we need to have performance-driven, kind of outcome-driven evaluation of programs like this. So what that means is that all of the entities in the criminal justice system should be on the same data platform, so that we're looking at data uniformly around the state. That has not been done.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that's a real push. I mean, as an example that's off of this emergency risk protection order, by the way, I tell you, they're telling me to call it the ERPO bill. I hate that. That's the only thing I don't like about this bill.
It is a mouthful.
I call it the Gabby Giffords bill.
Gabby
because-
Giffords bill.
yeah, because
yeah, I know
this
the
is-
Giffords Center has been pushing for this kind
They
of
are,
legislation.
and as a personal story, I will tell you that I met both Gabby and her husband, Mark Kelly, and that is a very, boy, if you want to talk about inspiring a legislator to get out there and work on a bill, I can remember meeting Mark Kelly, and he said, before a hi hello came out, it was, are you going to get this through the Senate?
How are you
So-
going to bring that sense of urgency and priority to the 60-day session where you have a lot of legislation?
I think not just this bill. I think
Okay.
this is our opportunity, and I mean everybody in New Mexico, to get this state moving again. So it's not just on gun control. We're going to have ethics. We're going to have major changes in crime, in healthcare, in education, even in voting rights. We're going to have lots of stuff going on, and I think there's an urgency.
We need to wrap up, but just one quick follow-up. When you these people, someone goes to have their guns removed, is this going to connect them with mental health services or other things they might need that precipitated this crisis?
I hope so. I mean, that's not obviously a requirement in the bill.
Okay.
But my hope is yes, ultimately what we want to do is if there's a problem, the idea would be to encourage people to get themselves involved in programs that can help them. But that's in no way mandated by this, and I don't want people to be confused by it. This is to remove one immediate, absolute danger in the household.
Okay, well, Representative Damon Ely, thank you so much for coming and talking with us.
Thank you very much for having me. This was really fun. Thank you.
And to discuss Representative Ely's bill on extreme risk protection orders, I'm joined by Detective Matthew Tinney. He's with the Crisis Intervention Unit with the Albuquerque Police Department. Nancy Koenigsberg is Senior Attorney with Disability Rights New Mexico. And Zachary Fort is President of the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association. Detective Tinney, Representative Ely mentioned hearing about this bill and how your team needed it at a conference. Why would this bill help the Crisis Intervention Unit at APD?
Well, I mean, I actually think I met him at that conference, and I was talking about the difficulties we have. So probably the number one behavioral health call that we respond to is actually related to suicide. And so a lot of times we're out with individuals who are at a crisis point and thinking about taking their life. And we have to take them to the hospital, and if they're talking to us about death by firearm, we're kind of limited on being able to take the firearm and hold it on that. And then there's other incidents, like we are the unit that refers or responds to any kind of potential active shooter or someone that's acting bizarrely and making statements. And in the past, we've had difficulty where someone's outside of their home and they're letting us know that they have a plan and that they have firearms. We are able to take them to the hospital, but the hospital's asking us, can you get their firearms? And we just can't on it. And so it's something that we struggle with law enforcement on being able to go in and detain firearms right now.
So they might go to the hospital and they have a firearm on their body, or they have it at home?
At home.
Okay. And so they're saying, can you remove this?
Right.
Okay. And you can't
Right.
legally right now.
Correct.
Okay.
And we still get, like, just last week I got a call from one of the major hospitals here from their psychiatric unit asking, hey, we have a patient here. We want to discharge them, but they're still having thoughts of suicide. Can you guys go and remove the firearm? I'm like, legally we can't. We can't just go into a house and remove a firearm for mental health.
Okay. How do you determine if someone is an imminent threat to themselves or others? That's one example.
Right. So, you know, a unique thing in New Mexico, it's kind of interesting, but law enforcement is the first responders, unfortunately, to behavioral health. Mm-hmm. So there's a state law that gives peace officers in this state the right to take someone against their will for a danger to themselves or others for a mental health evaluation. And so we're trained on that in our basic academy, and then for at least locally with APD, we go into a crisis intervention team training and other training for that. And so we assess for signs that look like behavioral health disorders or someone's in a crisis, and then, you know, asking the questions about danger to selves or others because of behaviors related to that.
But they're usually not held for a long time, so this is what
Yeah,
the
it's
issue
hit
is.
or
They're going to
miss.
go back to where they were.
Right.
Zachary Fort, you wrote an opinion column opposing this idea of extreme risk protection orders. What are your concerns about this bill?
So this bill, as it's currently written, has a litany of civil liberties issues. To start with, which I mentioned in my column, this bill relies very largely on ex parte court hearings where the party being accused would not be present in court. The first time they would be made aware that there has been charges brought up against them is when the police are at their door to confiscate their firearms. So it does not give them an opportunity to declare that they do not have firearms. It does not give them an opportunity to present a defense for themselves before they would have their constitutional rights suspended. That's the first issue. The second issue is that to move the order from a 10-day order to a 1-year order, the burden of proof is a preponderance of the evidence, not a higher level, which we would like to see. And the issue with that is these are people who have not been convicted of a crime who are having their constitutional rights suspended for up to a year, could go past a year, based on merely a preponderance of the evidence. And another issue that could result as from this bill is a law enforcement officer is named as a petitioner. So a law enforcement officer could target someone and execute a search warrant against them, confiscate their legally owned firearms based on the belief they might commit a crime sometime in the future.
It does have a mechanism. I hear what you're saying. The police can come take the firearms immediately, but then there is a hearing process where the person can
Yes.
have a lawyer, call witnesses.
There is a hearing process. Unfortunately, that happens after the fact, after someone's constitutional rights have already been suspended. And so the issue is that the ex parte type hearing, where the party is not present, is the rule as opposed to the exception in this type of bill.
So are there changes you could see that would make this bill more acceptable to your organization?
For this bill to be more palatable, we need to have stronger due process protections. The ex parte proceedings should not be the default. They should be very limited exceptions in emergency situations. I would like to see the burden of proof raised to at least clear and convincing evidence in order to suspend someone's constitutional rights for up to an entire year. I would like to see right now, people can only challenge this bill once in that 1 year, and they have to meet a preponderance of the evidence. People should have more opportunities to appeal their rights being suspended for an entire year, and then also limiting what law enforcement can do as a petitioner on this bill.
I'm struggling with, you're saying, I see the civil liberties issue, and I see the emergency issue that he
Yes.
deals with. And we know how slowly courts can move, so it seems like you need to take care of something right away to prevent something bad possibly happening. And this is trying to walk the line between that. But you'd like to see stronger protections.
I want to see stronger protections, and ex parte hearing should not be the default. So it should not be the default type of hearing. I would like to see people informed of the charges, their opportunity to bring counsel to represent themselves before having their firearms taken away. An ex parte hearing should only be used in incredibly limited circumstances, because that's where you're taking away someone's rights without giving them a hearing.
Isn't it possible if you did that, though, it could spur an action, either a suicide or a shooting or a mass shooting, if people knew that now they're under scrutiny and they could possibly have their arms taken away?
And we can speculate on what could happen. There have been studies that have been done that show it is very hard to predict if someone's going to do this. So I think that we're speculating on what could happen, but we do know that it would violate someone's constitutional rights.
Nancy Koenigsberg, policy debates around gun violence often ping between gun control, gun rights, and mental health. This is one idea that sort of looks to incorporate both. What's your take on this proposal as a mental health advocate?
We look at bills like this from the perspective also of civil rights, but the civil rights of people with disabilities, and whether or not a bill in some way inadvertently or on purpose unduly impacts the rights of somebody with a disability or mental illness. So on its face, Matt and I were talking, before we started this interview. On its face, people with mental illness are not the focus of the bill. People with behavioral health disorders, or whether it be TBI or all sorts of other things that could influence a person's behavior.
Traumatic brain injury.
Right. So there's no label there that if you have a mental illness or suspected mental illness, that therefore, we will attend to you with higher scrutiny, and you have an increased likelihood of having your Second Amendment rights violated. So from that perspective, there are a couple of pieces that I would like to see changed, but on that perspective, we have very little problem. I agree with Zach I was surprised about the preponderance of the evidence standard for taking it away for a year. But again, people with mental illness are not treated any differently than anybody else. So from that perspective, if that's the way everybody's treated, then that's the way everybody's treated. But again, I was a little bit surprised about that. But in terms of an issue that does seem to affect people with mental illness in a way that it wouldn't anybody else's, there's the release of information part, the consent that information is supposed to be kept confidential, except, and there's a list of exceptions, and you can drive a Mack truck through that.
So you're worried about
I'm
how
very
that would
worried
affect-
about that,
okay.
and we'll want to talk to Representative Eli about working on that piece. I'm hearing the concern about the ex parte, and the reason I don't think our agency, and I certainly personally don't have a problem with that, is that there are ex parte circumstances that are actually more egregious than having a weapon taken away for 10 days. For example, there are provisions for ex parte proceedings under guardianship, that the person can have a temporary guardian put in place and not have any notice of it before the full hearing on the merits of the case take place. So that's taking away somebody's total ability to make any choices about their lives, and then a hearing also within a relatively brief period of time with a hearing on the merits. So I hear that concern. Essentially there can be ex parte kinds of actions, if you will, in other mental health proceedings. So.
I want to clarify when you both say ex parte so people understand.
Sure.
This is outside.
Right. The person isn't present. The person isn't given notice, and the person isn't present. And then they're given notice of a hearing, and in this instance, it'll be 10 days down the road.
I want to ask you, Detective Tinney, Albuquerque police have had encounters with people in mental health crisis that were problematic, sometimes deadly. This has also happened around the country. So how can we be certain this kind of law won't be abused?
Well, I mean, any law can be abused. I mean, there's no way, I think, to say that people don't take advantage of certain situations. There's a lot more that I see at law enforcement be able to use this to actually protect people beyond just behavioral health. Mm-hmm. Another thing that unfortunately strikes Albuquerque specifically is domestic violence. So a lot of our homicides are related to domestic violence. And a lot of people that are offenders don't like to wait for the police to get there. I mean, this is kind of shocking to people.
I know we just had a case like this
right.
week. Yeah.
And so they leave, and a lot of times the victim's still there, and they're concerned what to do with the firearms, and they don't want to give it to police because they fear that they'll get abused because they gave it up. And if someone is, outstanding and has made threats, we would be able to protect that victim there as well. But, having this, at least here locally, we have a lot of systems in place, and we have a triage for how we respond to a behavioral health crisis. So at least here, if we were to take a firearm and would be able to tag it under this into evidence, we have services that could then follow up if it was behavioral health. So if a field officer had to request one of these emergency restraining orders for firearms, they would then forward it to our unit and let us know, hey, this firearm was taken because this person was a danger to themselves or others, a judge agreed on it, and it would become a case that we could follow up to make sure they're linked to services. So hopefully in the future, whatever caused that dangerousness is no longer there.
I hear what you're saying about the plan to implement that. That is not a requirement in this bill,
right.
Which it is in other bills around the country. So I hear your plan to do that. It doesn't mean that's going to happen around New Mexico, where you're connected to services.
I agree. And again, there is not necessarily always knowledge about the underlying decision of somebody to threaten themselves, obviously, but other people. So whether or not somebody is referred to treatment, and actually there's in the disclosure of information section here, there is something about that. Domestic violence is a huge issue which may not be related to a mental illness, but there are other things going on. So being able to have a requirement to refer to some social service or of some sort, I think should be part of the bill.
Part of it.
I would, again, whether my agency would advocate for that, I don't know. But I think as a matter of policy, if there are concerns about somebody's behavior and a reaction is, let's pick up a gun to go ahead and deal with that, a connection to somebody outside the family or outside, whatever group there is, seems to be a reasonable to be included.
Zachary, I want to ask you. These kinds of laws have been shown in some states to be very effective at preventing suicides. Homicide data is a little fuzzier. We have a very high suicide rate in this state. Nearly 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. About half of the suicides are committed with firearms. I'm curious, there have been some other initiatives with the gun rights community to address this. So if we don't have a bill like this, what kinds of things does your organization see could be possible to address these stats with guns in our community?
So the way we like to address issues like this, because obviously that is a concern, is give people incentives rather than regulations. Like we want to make sure, when we talk to firearm dealers, when they're selling a firearm to someone, make sure that you have your firearm so that people in your house who you don't want to access them can access them. I don't think we should force people to store their firearms a certain way, but I think we want to give people incentives to. So, for instance, a lot of gun companies and gun stores will hand out free gun locks for people to store their firearms in accordance with how they see fit to store their firearms. So I think it's an incentive-based thing to make sure there's an awareness in the community, and that's something when someone comes to me and says, this app, I'm interested in purchasing a firearm, I talk to them like, where do you live? What's your living situation? How do you plan on storing this firearm? That's something I have in personal discussions with my friends. So it's more of an incentive. Let's put this out there. Let's make sure people are having those conversations because I would much rather see incentives for people than regulations.
Okay, well, there's so much more to talk about, but we have to end it here. But we will continue to follow these issues as the legislative session continues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.